Professor tries to humiliate J.D. Vance. His response leaves the room in shock. Today wasn't just another political science lecture. Something bigger was about to unfold. At the podium stood Dr. Richard Calloway, a tenured professor known not just for his intellect, but for his brutal takedowns of conservative figures. He was a man who wielded his classroom like a weapon, using wit, mockery, and well-timed sarcasm to discredit anyone who didn't align with his ideology. And today, he had his sights set on someone in particular, J.D. Vance, a best-selling author. Well, J.D. Vance in my classroom, Calloway said, his voice laced with mock amusement. I must admit, I never expected someone like you to voluntarily walk into a space that values facts over political theater. But here you are. So, tell me, Senator, are you here to educate or to perform? A few students chuckled, sensing blood in the water. J.D. didn't flinch. Calloway continued, now pacing. You built your reputation as a champion of the forgotten Americans, and yet, here you are defending a movement that thrives on nostalgia instead of progress. Tell me, Senator, do you ever stop and wonder if you're just selling people a fantasy? This time, the students weren't just laughing. They were watching, waiting. J.D. Vance leaned forward. Slowly, deliberately, he clasped his hands together, meeting Calloway's gaze with unshaken confidence. Professor, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, he said, his voice measured but firm. Because what's happening in this room right now is exactly why so many Americans have lost trust in institutions like this one. The room went silent. J.D. continued. You call my work political theater, but tell me, what exactly do you call this? He gestured toward the professor. You're not asking me questions. You're attacking me. You're not inviting discussion. You're performing for applause. And that's the real problem, isn't it? Calloway's smirk wavered, but he quickly recovered. Oh, please, Senator. Spare us the victim act. You and your party have built an entire brand on playing the underdog while holding all the power. J.D. didn't blink. Power? Professor, let's talk about power. He stood up. Slowly. Power is a professor standing in front of a captive audience, using his platform to belittle someone who dares to think differently. Power is pretending to value open discourse, while shutting down any idea that challenges your own. And real power? J.D.'s voice grew sharper. Real power is when everyday Americans, people you mock as nostalgic, wake up and realize they've been lied to. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students looked uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, hooked. A few exchanged glances, as if realizing maybe for the first time that this wasn't just another one of Calloway's intellectual beatdowns. He had picked the wrong opponent. J.D. Vance wasn't just surviving this attack. He was winning. And what happened next would shock everyone. The room was dead silent. No one had expected J.D. Vance to push back this hard. Dr. Richard Calloway, who had spent years using his classroom as a personal stage for ideological battles, had just been called out in front of his own students. And for the first time, he didn't have a clever response ready. But he wasn't about to let J.D. take control of the conversation. The professor forced a smile, gripping the edges of his podium a little too tightly. Senator, you talk a big game about being silenced, but here you are, standing in front of a full lecture hall, speaking freely. That doesn't sound like suppression to me. J.D. let out a small laugh. Oh, I have no doubt I can speak freely today. But let's be honest, Professor. If I were a conservative student sitting in this classroom, raising my hand to challenge you, do you really think I'd get the same courtesy? Or would I be dismissed, mocked, told that my ideas are dangerous? A few students exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen it happen before. GD's eyes scanned the room. I don't say this to paint myself as a victim. I've fought too hard to play that game. But I do want these students to ask themselves a real question. If the only voices allowed in a classroom are the ones that agree with the professor, is that education or is it indoctrination? More murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dr. Calloway's expression hardened. Come now, Senator. That's an awfully dramatic way to frame an intellectual debate. I challenge my students to think critically, to question the status quo. You, on the other hand, push a narrative designed to keep people clinging to an outdated past. GD nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. That's an interesting accusation. Because what you call clinging to the past, I call remembering what built this country in the first place. The room tensed again. GD stepped forward, his voice steady. Hard work, family, faith, personal responsibility. These aren't outdated ideas, Professor. They're the foundations of a strong society. But instead of teaching students to engage with those values, debate them, challenge them, you ridicule them. And then you act surprised when people push back. Calloway opened his mouth to respond, but GD wasn't finished. You say you want students to think critically, but that only seems to apply when they agree with you. What happens when a student in this class raises their hand and says they believe in faith, that they value tradition, that they think hard work, not government programs, is the key to success? Are they treated with respect, or are they mocked like I was 5 minutes ago? A young woman sitting near the front shifted uncomfortably. She had asked similar questions before. She knew exactly what GD was talking about. Dr. Calloway let out a forced chuckle, trying to regain control. Senator, let's be honest. You and your movement aren't exactly known for welcoming opposing views either. You talk about free speech, but your party has built an entire platform on restricting progress, on silencing voices that don't fit into your version of America. GD's expression didn't change. Professor, tell me, when was the last time a conservative student in this class got a fair hearing? When was the last time you encouraged them to speak up without making them feel like an outsider? When was the last time you gave them a chance, instead of assuming they were wrong before they even opened their mouth? The professor's jaw clenched. He knew he was losing control. The smirks from earlier had disappeared. Some students were nodding, while others simply sat in stunned silence, realizing, maybe for the first time, that GD wasn't just defending himself. He was defending them. And then, just when the professor thought he could steer the conversation back in his favor, GD delivered a final blow that no one saw coming. For the first time in his career, Dr. Richard Calloway was speechless. The energy in the room had shifted. The confidence he had walked in with, the authority he had always commanded, all of it was slipping through his fingers. And GD Vance knew it. The senator didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't look triumphant. He simply stood there, arms crossed, waiting. Because he didn't need to win this argument. The truth was already doing that for him. Dr. Calloway cleared his throat. Senator Vance, let's not pretend that this is about fairness. The reality is, your party represents an ideology that has historically excluded people. You talk about tradition, but whose tradition? You talk about values, but whose values? And let's be honest, you didn't come here for a discussion. You came here to make a statement. GD tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then he spoke. You're right, Professor. I did come here to make a statement, but not the one you think. The room was silent. GD turned to the students. I came here because I believe in the power of conversation. I believe in debate. But what I see here today isn't debate. it's a performance. It's a professor using his platform to shame and ridicule people who think differently than he does. And the worst part, you all know it. A few students shifted uncomfortably. They had felt it before, the pressure to nod along, the fear of speaking up, the quiet understanding that some opinions were welcome in this classroom and others were not. GD's voice softened, but it was no less powerful. You see, I know what it's like to be dismissed. I grew up in a world where people like me, poor kids from broken homes, were told we'd never make it. I was told that my faith was outdated, that my values were irrelevant, that my background meant I didn't belong in rooms like this. But I fought. And now I stand here, not as a victim, but as proof that the American dream still exists if we're willing to fight for it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. GD turned back to Dr. Calloway. But the real problem, Professor, isn't me. It's you. It's the fact that instead of encouraging students to think for themselves, you tell them what to think. Instead of teaching them how to engage in real debate, you shame them for asking the wrong questions. That's not education. That's control. The professor opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in his career, he had no comeback. A single clap echoed from the back of the room. Then another, and another. Suddenly, half the lecture hall was on their feet. Some students clapped hesitantly at first, then more confidently as the reality of what they had just witnessed settled in. Others simply sat in stunned silence, realizing they had just seen something that wasn't supposed to happen. J.D. Vance had walked into this room outnumbered, outmatched, expected to be humiliated. Instead, he had exposed the truth. Dr. Calloway clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of his podium. His hands trembled. This wasn't just a classroom debate anymore. This was a moment that would be remembered. J.D. took a step back, his voice steady. I didn't come here to change your mind, Professor. I came here to show these students that they have a choice, that they don't have to be afraid to speak up, that courage doesn't come from agreeing with the loudest voice in the room. It comes from standing up for what you believe in, even when it's unpopular. A few students wiped their eyes. Others simply sat there, staring at J.D. Vance, not as a politician, but as something much bigger, as a reminder that conviction matters. J.D. glanced around the room one last time, then picked up his notebook and walked toward the door. Just as he reached it, he turned back. Education is supposed to be about truth, he said. So tell me, Professor, what lesson did we really learn today? And with that, he was gone. The applause continued long after he left. Dr. Calloway didn't move. He simply stared down at his notes, his mind racing. He had spent years controlling the narrative. But today, he had lost it. And in that moment, as the students in his classroom realized they had just witnessed something they would never forget, one thing became clear. J.D. Vance hadn't just won a debate. He had changed everything. Now I ask you, do you think students today are being taught how to think or what to think? Let us know in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe. We bring you real stories, real moments, and the truth that others try to silence. Because sometimes one voice is all it takes to start a movement.